Thanks very much, Padraig, for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here with you today to talk to you about this agri-food topic in the context of sustainability. The title of the presentation, A Sustainable Irish Agri-Food Sector, Future Challenges and Opportunities. In terms of the actual content, I'm going to talk in a very general sense because I'm assuming that the audience here today isn't really an audience that has a particular background in agriculture and the food sector. So I'm going to talk a little bit about context, the demographic challenge that exists in terms of feeding the world, the wider competition constraints and other challenges that exist for agriculture in the context of sustainability, the international political pressures that exist, some of the business momentum that exists in the sector currently, the Food Harvest 2020 initiative, which Padraig mentioned in his introduction. I'm going to talk in large measure about agriculture in the context of greenhouse gas emissions, because I think that's the real pinch point from the agri-food sector's perspective in Ireland in terms of sustainability. And I'm going to look a little bit at some of the solutions or issues which will contribute, or factors which will contribute to solutions to this issue. Well, if you look back at what's happened in the agri-food sector over the last 50 or 60 years, you'll see a number of phases, I suppose, that we've gone through over time. You went from a situation post-World War II in Europe where there was food rationing, a big agriculture on the environment as opposed to the environment on agriculture is probably the big issue from a sustainability perspective. I'm not going to talk about this graphic here, but it's something that you might want to dwell upon afterwards, and it shows a range of different short-term, fast-moving and slow-moving factors which will affect the agriculture or agri-food sector as we go forward to 2050. A little bit about Irish agriculture as an industry. It's a highly export-focused industry. For the main commodities of agriculture we produce, we export about 80 or 90% of what's actually produced in the country. So the domestic demand for food is quite a small element of what we actually produce. It's also a sector that's largely bovine-based, so we're talking about cows, and they generate a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. To the extent, in fact, that 30% of Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions come from primary agriculture, which is a very, very high percentage by the standard of developed economies. And the only other country globally in the developed world that would have anything like that level of emissions coming from the agriculture sector would be New Zealand. And a big constraint potentially that's out there is that Ireland is signed up to an agreement at the EU level to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 20% in aggregate relative to the 2005 level by 2020. Side by side with that, we also have a major industry-led initiative supported by government to expand Irish agri-food production considerably in the period to 2020. And that involves principally increasing the amount of milk, beef, sheep meat and pig meat that are produced in this country. And it's probably the reality that more production will imply more emissions, unless some means can be found to decouple production from the generation of those emissions. A sustainability question, as you can imagine. So what we ultimately need to do is to reduce quite radically the emissions per unit of output of food products. And that's going to be very difficult, especially in the context of a desire to grow the sector. But that's not the only constraint that's out there. There are the formal constraints that exist in terms of Ireland as a signatory to the Kyoto Protocol. There's this EU 2020 target, which I just mentioned, which is the commitment to reduce emissions by 20% by 2020. And there are informal pressures out there as well coming from retailers and consumers who are increasingly demanding of Irish food businesses that they demonstrate that they have a care for the environment. Now, when it comes to measuring greenhouse gas emissions, there are probably the two most well-known approaches to this are the formal IPCC framework, which is what's used for reporting of greenhouse gas emissions globally. And that's a sectoral-based approach. It looks at agriculture just purely in terms of the emissions that are produced at a farm level, measures it in aggregate, in other words, at a national level, what's the total level of emissions produced by agriculture in Ireland. It's confined to the national boundary, which means that if you import inputs, they don't count. Basically, the emissions associated with the inputs you import don't count against your emissions total. So it's, in some sense, a narrow definition. And that can be contrasted with the life cycle assessment or life cycle analysis type approach, which has a multi-sectoral basis in the sense that it's tracing all of the carbon or emissions or whatever you want associated with the production of an item, a food item, from the farm to the fork, essentially. So it's quite a different type of definition. It's not territorially based, so it's trying to measure emissions whether they're produced here or elsewhere in a production process. So it's a much wider definition. And one of the problems with that is that it creates particular incentives, I suppose, for people in terms of how they might actually address the emissions question. I've already talked about Food Harvest 2020, and I indicated to you that it would be likely that emissions would increase over time as a result of that. And what we can see here initially on the graphic is the path of greenhouse gas emissions from the agriculture sector up to the present time. And it has been decreasing over time, and that reflects increased efficiencies in the agriculture sector, reducing the emissions that are produced per unit of output. But over the period into the future, we're going to see a reversion to an upward trend in emissions, we believe, especially if these Food Harvest 2020 targets for growth in the sector are met. So the question then becomes, what can we do to pull that number down, basically? You know, are there mechanisms that exist that would allow us to produce more food, because that's something that we need to do given the growing global population, but at the same time mean that that agriculture and food production has less of an impact on the environment? And there are a whole range of measures, and I'm an economist, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to pretend to you that I understand these measures. And I'm sure that you're not going to be very interested in trying to understand them particularly either. But there are a range of measures that include improving the genetic merit of the cows in Ireland, increasing the rate at which animals grow in a given period of time, managing the manure that animals create more effectively, using things called nitrogen inhibitors, which reduce the amount of emissions associated with synthetic fertilizer use, so-called minimum tillage techniques, which means that you're releasing less carbon from the soil. So there are a whole range of measures that potentially can be used. And what we like to do ultimately is try to put a cost associated with those measures. In other words, to see which of those measures are most effective and which of those are maybe less effective or more expensive and maybe less likely to be feasible. And you can do this using what's called a marginal abatement cost curve. Ultimately, we think it would be possible to reduce Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions relative to that trend I talked about out to 2020 to some degree by deploying some of these technologies. And we reckon it would be possible to maybe grow the agriculture sector in line with the Food Harvest 2020 targets without too much of a change in agricultural emissions by 2020 compared to 2005. But that still means it's probably not ultimately what the objective is, because Ireland, as I mentioned earlier, faces quite a serious target in reducing its total emissions across the economy. I'm going to skip a couple of these slides here in the interest of time, but there's some information on the forestry sector if you want to take a look at it later. In terms of uncertainties, there are a range of uncertainties associated with how agriculture will impact on the environment in the short to medium term. Some of them are policy related in terms of how the Common Agricultural Policy will evolve, how WTO negotiations may evolve, the extent to which biofuel production targets continue to be an issue in Europe, the extent to which Ireland's commitment to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions may impact on agriculture in Ireland. And then over the longer term, and that's probably not something I've touched upon today because it is a longer term issue, you have the question, the reverse question, essentially, how will climate change impact on agriculture? But that is a longer term question, and much of the analysis that has been done to date suggests that it wouldn't have a particularly strong impact on agriculture in Ireland, but that's just taking a very narrow perspective. What are the long-term solutions ultimately here that we need to look at? Well, the first one probably is for governments to reprioritise agriculture and food research. There needs to be more money spent in this area because a lot of the benefits that we have today from research that has been done, it relates to research that was being done 20 and 30 years ago. So we need to be able to boost yields, increase the tolerance of crops and animals to stress, look at animal vaccines, enhance the shelf life of food so there's less food wastage, educate consumers to waste less food, enhance educational programs to farmers so they have a greater appreciation of the whole sustainability issue in the context of food. Maybe look at GMOs, a very controversial issue, but maybe it may be an issue that needs to be looked at in the context of the growing population. And ultimately the question, I suppose, is what is the balance between the environment and food production? And do we have that balance already? I don't know. And ultimately that's a political question, I think, and not one that's going to be resolved by science. So that's it. And I suppose we'll take questions at a later point. Thanks.